The judge asked if I understood the charges. I said yes. My voice didn't shake. That's the part that still gets me. Not that I lied, but how easily I did it. 3 rows behind me, my brother Connor was already staring at his hands, the picture of devastated family. He'd practiced that look in the mirror. I know he did. I was 19, he was 22. The crime was a series of fraudulent charges on our grandmother's credit card. $4,100 racked up over 6 weeks at gas stations, online gaming platforms, a cash withdrawal at an ATM 2 towns over. Graham was 81 and had no idea how to check her statements. By the time the bank flagged it, the money was gone, and someone was going to face a felony. Connor came to my bedroom window at 2 in the morning. Not the door, the window, like we were still kids sneaking out. And he didn't ask me to take the fall. Not in so many words. He said, "They're going to look at you anyway. The card was in your name. You were her caregiver that summer." He wasn't wrong. Graham had added me as an authorized user so I could buy her groceries. I was the one who drove her to doctor appointments, who slept on her couch the week she fell. And Connor was the one who memorized the card numbers while I was in the shower. I want you to understand something. Our family had a shape. Connor was the golden one, the firstborn son, the one who was going to be a lawyer, the one our mother still called my miracle baby in front of company. And I was the girl who made things easier, who fixed problems, who absorbed impacts. I'd been trained for that courtroom since I was 7 years old, and let him blame me for breaking the dining room window. So when he stood outside my window with his rehearsed desperation, "I'll make this right, Lila, I swear, I just need time," I already knew what I was going to do. The sad part? I thought I was choosing it. I pled guilty to 1 count of credit card fraud, a Class D felony. I was sentenced to 3 years of probation and ordered to pay restitution. No prison time. The judge took pity on the remorseful young woman with no prior record. But the felony followed me. It still does. Connor graduated from law school 2 years later, passed the bar on his first try. Our parents threw a party at a rented event space with a champagne fountain. I wasn't invited. I was working a double shift at a diner, trying to make the restitution payment that month. No one offered to help with it. No one mentioned the word felony at the champagne fountain. 22 years. That's how long I've carried this. 22 years of job applications where I checked the box. 22 years of rental applications that got mysteriously denied. 22 years of my mother introducing me as, "Our Lila, she's in customer service." The tone of voice that made it clear I'd already disappointed everyone I was supposed to. And I never said a word. Not one word. Now, around here, we don't just survive it. We understand it. And we understand it together. Because the thing about being the one who absorbs every impact, eventually, you run out of places to put it. So let me tell you how it all came apart. Not how I planned it. I didn't plan anything, not yet. But how the universe, or whatever you believe in, finally opened a door I didn't even know I was looking for. It started with a letter. Not a dramatic one, just a plain white envelope with a return address I didn't recognize, sitting in my mailbox on a Tuesday afternoon. And inside was a single sheet of paper that someone, somewhere, had sent to the wrong person. But that's the thing about wrong addresses. Sometimes they're exactly right. The envelope was addressed to a Marcus Webb. I almost threw it away. Return to sender, wrong mailbox, not my problem. But the return address stopped me. Whitmore and Chase, attorneys at law. The same firm that had handled Graham's estate after she passed, 7 years after my conviction. The same firm my mother had hired to make sure Connor got the house. I sat down at my kitchen table. The laminate was peeling at the edges. I'd been meaning to fix it for 3 years. The letter was thin, 1 sheet, maybe 2. My coffee went cold while I stared at the envelope, trying to decide if opening someone else's mail was worth the felony charge I already had. Irony's a funny thing. I opened it. The letter was from a junior associate, a woman named Camille Ortiz. She was handling the estate of a deceased private investigator named Frank Morrissey. Frank had been hired by Graham's bank, First Midwest Trust, back in the summer of 2001. The same summer I was 19 and sleeping on Graham's couch. The same summer Connor memorized the card numbers while I was in the shower. They'd hired him to investigate the fraud, quietly. The bank had doubts about my confession. They thought someone else was involved. They were right. Frank Morrissey had found the truth. He'd traced the IP addresses from the online gaming charges. He'd pulled surveillance footage from the ATM in Gilman, 2 towns over, on the night of the cash withdrawal. He'd built a file, and in that file there was a name, not mine. Connor Ashford, my brother, the golden one, the lawyer, the man who'd stood at a champagne fountain while I worked doubles to pay restitution for a crime he committed. The letter explained that Frank had passed away the previous year. His daughter had been cleaning out his office, a cramped room above a diner on Clifton Street, when she'd found a locked filing cabinet. Inside were dozens of case files from investigations that had gone nowhere, or so they thought. One file was labeled Ashford Eleanor, Fraud Investigation, 2001. The daughter, wanting to do the right thing, had contacted Whitmore and Chase to see if there was any legal obligation to disclose the findings. The statute of limitations on credit card fraud in this state is 5 years. The criminal case was long dead. But Camille Ortiz had written this letter to Connor anyway, not as a legal threat, but as a courtesy, a chance for him to come forward, to clear the record, to do the right thing before the file went to the State Bar Association. She'd addressed it to his old apartment on Morrison Avenue, but Connor hadn't lived there in 16 years. Marcus Webb lived there now. And Marcus Webb, whoever he was, had simply written "Return to Sender" and dropped it back in the mail. But the post office had misread the smudged address label. They'd rerouted it to the last forwarding address they had on file for anyone named Ashford in that zip code. Mine. I read the letter 3 times, then 4. By the 5th reading, my hands weren't shaking anymore. They were completely still. That's when I knew something had shifted in me. Something quiet. Something irreversible. Let me back up a moment, because you need to understand what 22 years looked like. After my conviction, I became the family's open wound. My mother, Patricia, never said the words, "You're a felon," out loud, but she didn't have to. It was in every Thanksgiving I wasn't invited to, every family photo I wasn't in, every time she introduced me as "our Lila," with that downward tilt of her chin, the pause before she added whatever job I was working at the time, waitress, cashier, customer service rep, as if the job itself was the disappointment and not the felony that had limited me to it. Connor, meanwhile, had built a life. He married a woman named Julia, an interior designer with perfect highlights and a laugh that sounded like a wind chime. They had 2 children, a golden retriever, a house in a subdivision with curved streets, and a homeowners association that fined you for leaving your garage door open. He was a partner at a mid-sized firm downtown, specializing in contract law. He wore suits I couldn't afford on my best year. And he never once, not in 22 years, asked me how I was doing. Graham died 7 years after my conviction. Emphysema. I was the one who sat with her in the hospice room, holding her hand while she struggled for breath. Connor sent flowers, lilies. She was allergic to lilies. I don't think he knew that. Or maybe he did and just didn't care. At the funeral, my mother hugged Connor and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I don't know what I'd do without you." She didn't say a word to me. I was standing 3 feet away. That night, I drove home and sat in my car in the parking lot of my apartment building for an hour, just staring at the dashboard. I wasn't crying. I wasn't even sad, exactly. I was empty. The kind of empty that feels permanent. The kind you stop noticing after a while because it's just who you are now. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon, 22 years later, I opened a letter meant for a stranger and found out that everything, my entire life, had been built on a lie I didn't need to tell. I didn't call Connor. I didn't call my mother. I didn't scream or cry or throw things. I just sat at my peeling kitchen table, holding a single sheet of paper, and I realized I had been handed something that most people who've been wronged never get. Proof. But what I didn't know yet, what I couldn't have known, sitting there with that letter in my hand, was that Connor already knew the file existed. He'd known for 2 years, and he'd been quietly, methodically, making sure I never found it. That battle hadn't even started, and I had no idea what he was willing to do to keep his secret buried. I called Whitmore and Chase the next morning, not because I had a plan. I didn't. I called because if I didn't speak to someone who could confirm that letter was real, I was going to convince myself I'd imagined it. The receptionist sounded young. I asked for Camille Ortiz. She put me on hold. I sat there listening to watered-down jazz, staring at the water stain on my ceiling that I'd been meaning to paint over for 2 years, and I realized my hands were cold. Not nervous cold, the cold of something long frozen, starting to crack. Camille came on the line with the cautious warmth of someone who handles other people's grief for a living. "Ms. Ashford," she said, "I'm so sorry for the confusion with the mail. I wasn't sure if you'd received it." I told her I had, that it had found me by accident, but that I was the one who needed to see it, the one who'd pled guilty. There was a long silence, the kind where you can hear someone deciding whether to trust you. "The file exists," she said finally. "Frank Morrissey was meticulous. He had screenshots, time-stamped surveillance stills from the ATM, IP logs tied to your brother's personal computer. The bank pulled the plug before he could submit his final report. They were afraid of liability for prosecuting the wrong person, but he kept everything. Ms. Ashford, I've seen it. It clears you, completely." 22 years, 3 words, completely. I asked her to send me copies. She said she would, but then her voice shifted. It got lower, careful. She said she needed to tell me something else, something she hadn't put in the letter. 2 weeks before that letter went out to the wrong address, she'd called Connor directly at his law firm. She'd identified herself, explained that a file had surfaced in the Morrissey estate that might be relevant to an old family matter, and asked if he'd be willing to discuss it. His response had been immediate and surgical. He told her that his sister had a documented criminal history, that she was known to fabricate claims, and that any further contact would be met with a defamation suit. He'd used the word harassment. He'd CC'd his firm's general counsel. He'd recorded the call. He'd been preparing for this, for years. He had a protocol. Camille told me that the following week, the physical file, the original Morrissey folder, the one with the photographs and the handwritten notes and the surveillance stills, had gone missing from a locked cabinet in the office. No sign of forced entry, no surveillance footage, just gone. She'd filed an internal report, but nothing had come of it. She suspected Connor, but she couldn't prove it. And her firm wasn't interested in a 22-year-old fraud case with no living client and no billable hours. Now, I'm going to pause here because I need you to understand something about the man my brother became. Connor Ashford is not a person who made a mistake and felt bad about it. He's a person who spent 2 decades constructing a version of reality in which he was the victim of a troubled sister who'd always been weak, always been difficult, always been less. And when someone threatened that version, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a file folder full of truth, he didn't panic.
He didn't confess. He made it disappear.
Quietly, professionally, without leaving a mark. That's not shame. That's predation. And predators are never more dangerous than when they're cornered. So if your stomach is tight right now, if you're feeling that cold knot that says this man is going to do something worse before this is over, trust it, because you're right. And around here, we don't look away from that. We understand it. And understanding Connor was the only thing that saved me from what he did next. Camille emailed me digital scans that afternoon, 47 pages. I printed them at the public library because my printer at home had been broken since the second Bush administration. I sat at a carrel in the corner, spreading the pages out in front of me like evidence in a trial that had already been lost. And there he was, Connor, 19 years old, caught in a grainy ATM still, withdrawing $300 at 11:40 at night. Connor's IP address, logged into a gaming site at 2 in the morning from the family desktop. Connor's name, handwritten in Frank Morrissey's notes, underlined twice. I sat there for 2 hours. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I just looked at every page one by one, letting 22 years of invisible weight shift into something I could finally see. Proof. When I finally packed up the pages and walked out into the library parking lot, the sun was setting. I stood next to my car, a 12-year-old sedan with a dent in the passenger door and a check engine light I'd been ignoring. And I let myself imagine it, just for a moment, clearing my record, getting the felony expunged, applying for jobs that didn't ask about convictions, telling my mother the truth and watching her face as she realized what she'd done to me. It felt like dreaming about winning the lottery. Nice, but not real. But what I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, standing in that parking lot with 47 pages of vindication in my bag, was that Connor had already made a phone call I knew nothing about. While I was printing pages at the library, he was on the line with a contact he'd cultivated for exactly this moment. Someone who owed him a favor. Someone who could reach into a system and make something, or someone, disappear. That call would reach me in less than 48 hours, and it would turn every piece of proof I was holding into a trap I never saw coming. 48 hours later, a police officer knocked on my door. Not a detective, a uniformed patrol officer, young, with the kind of stiff posture that told me he'd rehearsed what he was about to say. He asked if I was Lila Ashford. I said yes. He handed me a folded document and said I was being served with a petition for a temporary restraining order. The petitioner was Julia Ashford, my brother's wife. The woman with the wind chime laugh and the perfect highlights. The woman I'd met exactly 4 times in my entire life, most recently at a grocery store 3 years ago, where we'd exchanged approximately 12 words about the price of avocados. The petition alleged that I had been stalking the Ashford family, that I had made repeated and escalating threats, that I had been seen parked outside their home at night, that Julia feared for her safety and the safety of her children. Attached as Exhibit A was a single piece of evidence, a printout of a text message, from my number, sent to Julia's phone 2 nights before. I had never sent Julia Ashford a text in my life. The message read, "You took everything from me. Now I'm going to take everything from you. Watch your back." The officer watched my face as I read it. I don't know what he saw. I don't know what I looked like. But I remember feeling the world tilt sideways, the way it does when you realize someone has been moving pieces on a board you didn't even know you were standing on. I told the officer I hadn't sent that text. I told him I had proof, actual proof, that my brother had framed me for fraud 22 years ago, and that this restraining order was retaliation. He nodded. He looked uncomfortable, but he did his job. He told me the temporary order was effective immediately. I was prohibited from contacting Julia, Connor, their children, or anyone in their household. I was prohibited from coming within 500 feet of their property, their workplaces, or the children's school. A hearing was scheduled in 3 weeks to determine whether the order would be made permanent. I could attend, I could present evidence, but until then, I was legally a threat. I closed the door and I sat down on my floor. Not my couch, my floor. The carpet was thin and I could feel the concrete underneath. And I thought about how perfectly he'd done it. Connor hadn't tried to dispute the Morrissey file. He'd just made me too dangerous to believe. If I came forward with the proof now, I'd look like a vengeful felon, fabricating documents to harass the family that had been forced to seek legal protection from me. The restraining order didn't just silence me. It made my truth sound like a lie. But here's what Connor didn't understand. He'd spent 22 years thinking of me as the girl who absorbed impacts, the girl who said yes at the bedroom window, the girl who pled guilty and worked doubles and never told anyone the truth. He thought I was still 19, still scared, still trainable. And maybe I was for a long time. But something had changed in me when I read that Morrissey file. Something that didn't reverse when the restraining order landed. It just focused. I stood up from the floor, I went to my laptop, I opened a new document, and I started writing down everything I knew about Connor Ashford. Every lie he'd ever told, every person he'd ever used, every crack in the perfect facade he'd spent 2 decades constructing. Because here's the thing about men like my brother. They don't build lives, they build sets. And every set has a backstage. Every set has a door that opens if you know where to press. I'm going to step out of the story for just a second, because I need to check on you. How are you doing right now? Because I know this part is hard. The part where the person who hurt you doesn't just not apologize. They double down. They make you the villain. And if you've ever been in that position, if you've ever stood there holding the truth while someone else held the microphone, then you know exactly what Lila was feeling. So if your chest is tight, just breathe. She's not done yet. Neither are you. Drop a fire emoji in the comments if you're still with her. I'm right here. The first thing I did was call Camille Ortiz. Not to cry, not to ask for help, just to tell her what had happened and ask one specific question. Who else had access to the Morrissey file before it went missing? She gave me 2 names. One was a senior partner who'd retired the year before. The other was a paralegal named Dennis, who'd been terminated for cause. Something about forging timesheets. I called Dennis. It took me 4 hours to track him down. He was working at a used car dealership in Hanover. He was bitter about the termination, eager to talk to anyone who'd listen. And what he told me made the floor drop out from under me. Dennis said that 2 weeks before the file went missing, Connor Ashford had called the office. Not Camille, not the front desk. Dennis. He'd identified himself. He'd been polite. He'd asked if there were any open files related to the Ashford name. And Dennis, who had no idea what he was looking at, had pulled the Morrissey folder, scanned the first few pages, and confirmed it existed. Then he'd told Connor exactly where in the office the file was stored. Which cabinet, which drawer, which folder. Connor hadn't needed to break in. He'd needed directions. And Dennis, unwittingly, had given him the map. That was the moment I realized I couldn't do this alone. I couldn't just walk into the restraining order hearing with 47 pages of proof and hope for the best. I needed someone who knew how to fight in a courtroom. Someone who wouldn't flinch when Connor's lawyers started throwing around words like felon and stalker and credibility. Someone who could take everything I'd gathered and turn it into a weapon. And I knew exactly where to find her. Her name was Mariah Everett. She was a criminal defense attorney with a practice in a converted Victorian house on Edgewood. The kind of lawyer who'd spent 20 years defending people the system had already decided to throw away. I'd found her 3 years earlier, when I'd applied for a receptionist job at her firm. I didn't get the job. She'd hired someone with a paralegal certificate. But I remembered the way she'd looked at my application. She hadn't flinched at the checked box. She'd asked me what happened, and I'd told her the truth. The whole truth, for the first time in my life, and she'd listened without interrupting. Then she'd said, "If you ever need someone to fight, call me." I'd never called, until now. I walked into her office on a Thursday morning, 47 pages of the Morrissey file in a manila folder under my arm. Mariah was at her desk, a woman in her late 50s with short silver hair and glasses pushed up on her forehead. She looked up, recognized me, and said, "You finally ready to fight?" I laid everything out. The original conviction, the Morrissey file, the missing originals, Camille's confirmation, Dennis's confession, the restraining order, the fabricated text. She didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she took off her glasses, set them on the desk, and said, "The restraining order is the play. If he makes it permanent, your credibility is shot. If we beat it, we flip the board. You're not the defendant anymore. He's the one with something to hide." Mariah explained that the hearing was a civil proceeding, lower burden of proof, looser rules of evidence. Julia and Connor's attorney would argue that I posed a credible threat. They'd point to the text message, the pattern of harassment, the felony on my record. They didn't need to prove I was dangerous beyond a reasonable doubt. They just needed a judge to sign a piece of paper. Our job was to make sure that paper was the last thing any judge would want to sign. We had 3 weeks. Mariah went to work like someone who'd been waiting for a case exactly like this. She subpoenaed the phone records. She deposed Dennis. She contacted the State Bar Association and filed a formal inquiry about Connor's call to the paralegal and the subsequent disappearance of the file. And she did something I never would have thought of. Something so beautifully specific, it still makes me shake my head. She subpoenaed the GPS data from Connor's car. Connor drove a late-model sedan with a built-in navigation system tied to his phone. He'd opted into location sharing for his insurance discount, the kind of detail a man like Connor doesn't think about because he's never had a reason to. But Mariah thought about it. And the GPS data told a story Connor had never meant to tell. On the night before the Morrissey file went missing, Connor's car was parked on Clifton Street, the street where Camille's office was located, from 11:42 p.m. until 12:18 a.m. He hadn't driven his own car to work that day. He'd taken Julia's. But his phone had been in his pocket. And his phone had tracked every step. He'd broken into the office. Not Camille's firm, he wasn't that stupid. The file had already been moved to an off-site storage unit that the firm used for closed cases, a converted warehouse. And Connor, armed with Dennis's directions and his own arrogance, had walked right in. Mariah had an investigator pull the security footage from the warehouse. The camera at the side entrance had been broken, had been for months. But the camera across the street at a convenience store had been working perfectly. It showed a man matching Connor's description entering the warehouse at 11:52 p.m. and leaving at 12:14 a.m., carrying something under his coat. A folder. The right size, the right shape, the right man. We had him. Not for the fraud, that was still outside the statute of limitations, but for breaking and entering, for theft, for filing a false restraining order petition, for perjury, because Connor had signed an affidavit swearing that I had threatened his family, and we could now prove not only that he'd fabricated the text, but that he'd stolen a file that exonerated me, and then used a court to silence me for trying to expose him. That wasn't just a bad look, that was a felony, a real one this time. The night before the hearing, I sat in my apartment and I looked at the Morrissey file again. 47 pages. The same pages I'd printed at the library. The same pages I'd spread out on a carrel while the sun went down outside. And for the first time in 22 years, I didn't feel like a felon. I didn't feel like the family disappointment. I felt like a woman who'd been wronged and was finally about to be believed. But I want to pause here because I know what you might be thinking. You might be thinking this is the part where the good guys win, where the courtroom doors swing open and justice pours in like sunlight. And it is, but not the way you think. Because Connor had one more move, one more card he'd been holding. And when he played it, it nearly worked. Because he didn't try to beat the evidence. He tried to make sure I never made it to the hearing. And around here, we don't flinch from the hard parts. We sit with them. We learn from them. We understand them. And then we walk into that courtroom anyway. The morning of the hearing, I woke up to an email from my mother. The first email she'd sent me in 4 years. The subject line was one word: please. And I opened it, hands trembling, and read a message that was never meant to protect me. It was meant to protect Connor. Always Connor. And it broke something in me that I didn't even know was still intact. The email from my mother was 7 paragraphs long. I read it 3 times, sitting at my kitchen table while the coffee went cold. The same table where I'd opened the Morrissey letter. The same peeling laminate. The same water stain on the ceiling. Everything in my apartment was the same. I was not. She didn't ask me to drop the case. Not in those words. She asked me to think about the children. Connor's children. My niece and nephew. A boy and a girl I'd never been allowed to meet. She said the family had suffered enough. She said Connor had made mistakes, but he was a good man, a good father. And didn't I understand how much damage this would do? Didn't I understand that some things were better left in the past? And then, the line I will never forget. She wrote, "You already took the blame once. What difference does it make now?" What difference does it make now? 22 years of my life, and she asked what difference it made. 22 years of checked boxes and denied apartments and jobs I couldn't apply for and family gatherings I wasn't welcome at. 22 years of being the shameful daughter, the cautionary tale, the one who absorbed every impact so the golden sun could keep shining. And she asked what difference it made. I didn't reply. I closed my laptop. I finished my coffee. I put on the blazer I'd bought at a consignment shop for $14, the only court-appropriate clothing I owned. And I drove to the courthouse. The hearing was in courtroom 4B, a small room with fluorescent lights and wooden benches that smelled like old varnish. Julia sat in the front row with Connor beside her, his hand on her knee, the picture of a protective husband. He was wearing a suit that cost more than my car. He didn't look at me when I walked in. He couldn't. Looking at me would have meant acknowledging that I existed, that I was real, that I had walked into a courtroom with my head up and my evidence in my hand. Mariah was already at our table. She'd arranged the exhibits in a neat row. The Morrissey file, the phone records, the GPS data, the warehouse footage, Dennis's deposition, the text message metadata, proving the message to Julia had been sent from a device registered to Connor's own account. A burner phone. Sloppy. Traceable. She'd also subpoenaed Connor's firm-issued laptop, the one he'd used to send the fake text through a spoofing app he'd forgotten to delete. Julia's attorney presented first. He talked about fear, about a pattern of harassment, about the text message and the threatening tone and the troubled history of the respondent. He used the word felon 4 times. He made me sound like a monster. And then it was our turn. Mariah stood up and she did not raise her voice. She did not gesture dramatically. She simply walked the judge through 47 pages of evidence, one piece at a time, connecting dots with the patience of someone who knew she didn't need to perform because the facts were doing the work for her. She showed the court that the text message had been sent from a burner phone activated 2 days before the petition was filed, activated at a store 2 blocks from Connor's office, paid for with a credit card in his name. She showed the GPS data, placing him outside the warehouse on the night the file was stolen. She showed the warehouse footage. She showed the Morrissey file, the original investigation that had exonerated me 22 years ago, suppressed by the bank, buried by my brother, and now laid out on a courtroom table for everyone to see. And then she called Julia to the stand. Julia walked up with the nervous confidence of someone who'd been told the plan was foolproof. Mariah asked her 3 questions. Mrs. Ashford, before the night you received that text message, had Lila Ashford ever contacted you? No. Had she ever visited your home? No. Had she ever, in the 4 brief interactions you've had with her in 22 years, made any statement that could be interpreted as threatening? No.
And then Mariah said, "Mrs. Ashford, did your husband tell you to file this petition?"
Julia looked at Connor, just for a second, a flicker, the kind of look that says everything. And then she looked at her hands and she didn't answer. She didn't have to. The judge dismissed the petition with prejudice. That means it couldn't be refiled. That means it was over. But Mariah wasn't finished. She filed a formal complaint with the State Bar Association the same afternoon, attaching the evidence of Connor's theft, his perjury, his attempt to suppress exculpatory evidence. She filed a criminal complaint for breaking and entering. She filed a motion to have my record expunged. She filed so many things I lost count. Connor was placed on administrative leave from his firm within 72 hours. The Bar Association opened an investigation. The breaking and entering charge was referred to the district attorney. But here's what justice looked like in the end. It didn't look like a perp walk. It didn't look like a dramatic confrontation. It looked like Connor Ashford standing in a courthouse hallway, his wife walking 3 paces ahead of him toward the parking lot, not looking back. It looked like my mother calling me 6 months later, after the expungement went through, after the Bar Association suspended his license, after Julia filed for divorce, and saying in a voice I barely recognized, "I didn't know." And me saying, "You didn't ask." The expungement came through on a Thursday. I didn't celebrate. I didn't call anyone. I just sat in my apartment, the same apartment with the peeling laminate and the water stain, and I looked at the piece of paper that said my record was clear. 22 years. And then I did something I hadn't done since I was 19. I applied for a job that asked if I'd ever been convicted of a felony. And I checked, no. Some stories don't end with an apology. They end with a boundary. And that's enough. Connor never apologized. He never will. But I don't need his apology anymore. I needed my name back, and I took it. Quietly, legally, in a courtroom with fluorescent lights and old varnish. No screaming, no revenge fantasy. Just the truth, finally, on the record. Around here, we don't just survive it, we understand it, and then we let it go. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever been the one who absorbed every impact for someone who never even said thank you, then you know why this channel exists. You are not watching this alone. Subscribe if you want to sit by the fire with us. I'm Dee. The firelight is always on. I'll see you next time.